Hi. Yes, so I am going to talk to you about hooks today, and just a quick show of hands. Who here has heard about hooks or React hooks? Who has used them in an app? Okay, just a few hands. And like an app in production? All right, smart. Yes, so today I will tell you like a quick brief summary of what hooks are and what is the state of them, and then we'll go through a quick live coding demo. It's going to be scary. I've never done that, so hopefully we can also do some more programming maybe you can help me. And at the end I will tell you some of my experiences from using hooks in, I think, 3 projects right now. And the Lego figures, my girlfriend recently joined Lego, and I have Lego all over my apartment now, so I was just like thinking about that and found some Legos with hooks. All right, so if we were to summarize hooks in one sentence, we can try to do it, but who can do it better than Dan? And that's his take on this. So it's reuse stateful logic between components. So that's sort of like the theme behind hooks. And this has been in the past solved multiple ways in React. You can think of the render probs and higher order components. So this is sort of like a framework provided way to do exactly that. Yes, so a quick primer on what they are. They are basically a new API exposed by React. And they come in the form of a number of named exports from the React library. Currently, there is 10 of them. That number sort of fluctuates as they are still in beta. And they are all just plain functions, but they're not pure functions. They're actually side effectful functions. And they all follow this naming convention of like use something. So for example, in this case, it's use state. And they all have like different return values and different input parameters. So you sort of have to learn the API of each of them. And that's like the very basic example of how you can use a use state hook to create a counter. So that's fairly intuitive what's happening here, unless you're confused by this array spread syntax, but that basically means that the return value of use state is an array with 2 elements. The one is the value, and the second one is the setter. And these 10 hooks are these. I think I counted them all right, maybe not, I don't know. Anyway, there is a 3 what React team calls basic hooks, meaning they are the ones you will use most often, most probably. And then you have the additional hooks that are usually used for some like special use cases. There's a lot of use of word use in here. They've been introduced back in October and are still set to be experimental. But they are expected to be in a stable release next month. Again, Dan tweeted that on January 19th that they expected to be in 2 weeks, which would be around now, and there is some gossip that maybe it's going to happen next Monday, where you can like officially use hooks as a feature of React. But as it usually is with Facebook, they've been sort of battle testing it behind the scenes, so it's very unlikely, and it was sort of unlikely from the beginning, in my opinion, that the API would change vastly. There were changes from between when they announced it and now, but they were like mostly adding some small hooks and some very small changes. Yes, and there are some rules around using hooks. So they are just functions, but they have some special properties. So you can only call them from within a functional React component. So for example, you cannot call them in the class React component, and you cannot call them just like outside of React altogether. So only during a functional component render call. And you always need to call, if you have multiple hooks, then you always need to call them in the same sequence, and you can never call them conditionally. So even if you have one hook, then you always need to call it. That's a little bit of an implementation detail leaking out to how we can use it, but it's a fairly simple rule to follow, and in reality, you don't really ever like hope that you could use it conditionally. Yeah, there is this pattern. It's not really like it doesn't come in any shape from React, but it's a pattern that the React team calls custom hooks, where you extract some code that uses one of these 10 hooks into your own function, and then you call it with the same naming convention, the use. And we've seen that in the previous presentation for the form hooks. There was like use form and use input. These are these custom hooks. So basically, they are functions that inside their implementation you will find one of these 10 hooks or more. Yeah, so just some key facts here. That hooks don't add any new features to React. So you won't be able to do anything that you weren't able to do previously with the hooks. So it's just an alternative way of using the existing features. They are an alternative to class components, meaning you can now use only functional components, even if your app requires state or effects. And they're also an alternative to these sort of homegrown solutions for reusing stateful logic, which are the higher order components and render props. And they are advertised as a more ergonomic and composable way of reusing stateful code as opposed to these two. And all of this is backwards compatible, so you can just use hooks in your existing React application, everything will be working together. So there is a very nice migration path, or sort of a way to introduce it if you want to use them. So it's not like all in. Yes, and now let's try to build something with hooks so we get a better feeling of what they're actually all about. For which I will move to a screen here. And you have to tell me how is the font size. Is that okay? All right. Cool. So what I thought would be a nice thing to build is something that like I stumbled upon at work, which is building a responsive chart. And I open it here in a different window. So very rudimentary styling here, but the idea is that you have a chart like this with some data, and if you start resizing it, then the number of the bars that you draw is different. So you sort of never go below some width of the bar, and then because there is more data than fits on the screen, then you have this pagination thing, where you can click around these buttons, and then these buttons get disabled if you get to the edge of the data. And you can also use arrow keys, so now I'm using arrow keys left and right. And one more thing is that in the URL you can see the offset that I'm moved by. Now sort of this windowing here is reflected. So that's a fairly simple application, and it's obviously doable in the React without hooks, and it wouldn't be like much effort to do it, but let's try and see how hooks help us in this scenario. So we're gonna start with just an empty, very basic React app. Here I have generating of the data, so that's like 100 random numbers. in a format that will suit the graphing library that we use, and some simple styles here. And the graphing library I'm using here is called Victory. I don't know if any of you know it, but it's a fairly nice charting library where everything is composable. And this is basically how we're gonna be using it. So we require 2 components and then pass some data to this Victory bar thing. So let's see how that works. So we need to install Victory. And then import it, something from Victory. And that something is a Victory chart and Victory bar. And then we can here use the chart. So now I have some chart here, and then the Victory bar comes here. And what they do is, like, if you don't pass any data, they render something just so you can see it works. But we have the data here, so we can pass it and see what happens. So we have all of our 100 bars here fitted on one chart. And if we resize this, then you can see the problem is that it basically behaves as an SVG. So there isn't any like dynamic stuff in here. So, So what we need to do is actually measure the available space and then calculate how many bars we can fit, and then tell Victory exactly what it should render. So for that we can use our first hook, and that's going to be a custom hook. I actually already have it installed here. So it is called rehook/component size. Let's import that. So again, the naming convention, it's a hook, so it starts with use. Use component size from this rehook thing. And there's some return value here. It's going to be this, right? And then what it actually requires, it's hard to see here, but it needs a ref. And usually we could use like React.create_ref to create a ref to an element, but we can also use a hook that React provides to do exactly that, where we can say that our wrapper ref is actually React.use ref. That will create a ref for us, and then we can pass it here, and we also need to attach it to an element like this. So now we can also peek and see what this return value is. Oh. Yes. Yep. So it basically returns width and height of this main element, and it gets it from some styles. So basically, it's like all view and half of the height. But if I start resizing this, then you will see that the value is changing. So if I resize, then the element is re-rendered and this console log is called again. So definitely this use component size, inside of it there is some code that creates some kind of event listener for the resize, or maybe it's using one of these new fancy APIs for checking for resizing the observers, and then it's returning the value. So we can now use these values here. So if we say width and height, and we can say to the chart, so at least we'll have it fill the available space, sort of like this. Maybe we can just make it a bit taller. Yeah. So that works, but the problem is still that we only show, we always show all of these bars, so that doesn't help us much. So now I'll just copy paste some code here. All right, so we have some minimum bar width, so we don't want to go below that, and that's essentially in pixels. And then the bar ratio is basically how much of the space available to one data item the bar will take. And then this axis width is basically just something coming from the library, basically how much of the entire chart is this axis on the left. So then basically we calculate how much the data width is, and then we say, okay, then how many bars we can fit provided the minimal bar width, and then what is the bar width in pixels. So when we have this, then we can say that the bar width here is the bar width. And of course it doesn't work like that because we still render all of the data. So then we need to say that the slice data is actually our data, and then slice it from the beginning to the bar count. All right, then we have like 3, and maybe then we more, and it just starts to work, right? There's still this problem of like going overboard, and that's something a little bit weird in this Victory.js library, so we actually have to specify what they call the main padding. And in our case, it has to be only in the x-axis, and we need to say that it's the bar width divided by 2. Then they will sort of squeeze. And that's actually here. Yep, so there it fits nicely. All right. So what we can do now is, like, all this logic is just here in our app function. So we can do what React team is sort of encouraging you to do, which is create your own custom hook. Basically, that means we take this code and we create a new function called like use responsive chart or something like that. That will take all this code here, and we paste it here, including our custom hook. And we can see that it needs to have the wrapper ref provided as an input, and it needs to return something. And what it can return, we can see, okay, it's like this stuff here, we can maybe call something like const chart props, maybe. It's like width and height, and the main padding. So we can return that. And what else do we need from that hook? We need the bar count. And the bar width is also used here, right? So we also need to return that. So now we can use our custom hook. So more or less take this here and say that's gonna be our use responsive chart, where we pass the ref to our main element, and then we remove all of this stuff. Nope, too much. This. And then we can use our chart props here, and basically we're done. We actually don't need this either. It's inside there. Yep. So now our render function is like super clean. And that shows you how you can use hooks to encapsulate the stateful logic, like related stateful logic. So all of this is sort of related to measuring how much you can fit in the chart. And there is no reason to pollute our render function here with that. So the next thing we wanted, if we go back to our reference implementation here, we wanted these buttons. How am I doing on the time? All right. So we're gonna probably render some buttons here. I'm just gonna say previous maybe, not buttons, just one. And another one, just gonna say next. Of course they don't do anything yet, so we need to say that when I click it, then we do something like on next, and when I click this one, then I do on next, actually, on previous. And I also want to disable it, so we'll say that it's disabled when pref disabled, and this one is disabled when the next is disabled. And so we need these 4 values from somewhere. So let's just comment it out. So we still, let's move it out and comment it out. So we still have something rendering here, but we need these 4. So we need this to be a function, and we also need this to be a function. And we need this guy, the previous disabled, and we need the next disabled. Not sure what that will be yet. But one thing we for sure can observe here is that this introduces some state to our application. So the state is basically just one number, and it's this offset. So we need to store it something, and we've already seen how hooks can help with that. You create a state variable. So let's call it offset. And then we also get the setter from our React use state. And the argument to the use state hook is the initial value. So like when we first visit the page, we want it to be at 0, right? Because we want it to be at the beginning. So immediately this offset will take a value of 0. And then when we say, like when we click the previous button, then we want to set the offset to the value of the current value of offset minus the bar count, right? Because we want to go like 1 page back. And when we go next, then we just want to go 1 page forward. And for now, let's just do this so we see it working. So they're never disabled. Then we paste these back in. All right, so hopefully now, nope. Let's see what's wrong here. Okay, so we actually haven't used the offset to do anything. And that's probably why. So our slicing needs to change, right? So our slicing now doesn't go from 0 to bar count, it goes from the offset to the bar count plus the offset, right? It's like just a moving window. And then when I move it, then it moves around, right? Then of course the problem is that if I now press previous being on the 0, then it should go to like some kind of minus stuff, right? Then of course breaks. So we need some kind of guards here. I'm just gonna copy paste that. more or less just math.min and math.max to make sure that we never go overboard. And then, for example, the previous should be disabled if our offset is at 0, right? So when I move here, then it should be disabled. And then the next should be disabled when I'm sort of close enough to the edge that I see all of them. And I'm also gonna paste that. It's just this. Right, so our offset plus how many we have is actually larger or equal the length of all of the data. So then when we go all the way, oh, it's actually 100, so it's gonna take a while. Right. Then now we have the button disabled. Again, this logic seems related. So we might again use a custom hook to say const use pagination. Paste all that in. And then we can see we're gonna need a bar count. And that's we also need data. Right? And then we're gonna return some stuff from this hook. So for sure we need the slice data to pass to the chart component, and possibly like all this stuff for the buttons, right? And again, I'm gonna cheat here and just copy paste that. Right, so we have the properties for the previous button and we have the properties for the next button. And then we're gonna take our hook and use it instead of all this logic. We'll just have const something equals this, and we're gonna only pass the data and the bar count if I remember correctly, and then this is what we get back. And then we need to spread these on the button, and again, just to speed things up, I'm gonna copy this. So our buttons are now nice and clean. And I named it differently here. Let's just roll with that. All right, so one thing that you've observed now is that these custom hooks and hooks in general work very nicely together, right? So the value we get from the use responsive chart is then passed on to the use pagination as an input. And the value we get from the use ref, it gets passed to the use responsive chart, right? So usually there is a very natural sort of way in which these hooks have dependencies on each other. I haven't stumbled upon a situation where there's like a cyclic dependency when one needs the data from the other. If you get on that, then it's probably some kind of wrong abstraction that you used, meaning the logic that you abstracted to these custom hooks was actually related enough that it should maybe be one hook and not multiple ones. Yes. So now, let me just check my scenario here. Pagination. Yes, then the next step would be to let's use some more hooks. So in this particular app, the hooks that I'm going to use now, they're not really needed because it's not a performance-heavy app, and there isn't like a deep component tree that you interact with. But it's still nice to see how they can be used. And I'm talking about the memorization hooks. So there is one for callbacks, and there is one for just like general any value that you can memorize. And I think, in fact, the callback one is just a special case of the memo one. So we can try with the first one. So imagine that calculating this data here, the slice of data, it's a like computationally expensive thing, and you don't want to do it on every render. and you only want to do it when like these values change. So the way you can do it is by using the use memo hook, and that takes a function, and the return value from that function is going to be the return value of the entire hook, like this. And that in itself, it doesn't do anything because you need to add a second parameter to the use memo hook, and that is then an array of dependencies. And the array of dependencies basically means what stuff from the outer context or outer scope am I using inside my hook. So in this case, we're using the offset and we're using the bar count. It's getting a bit too broad here. All right. So now this value, this computation will only happen if the offset is changed or if the bar count is changed, meaning basically if I press one of these buttons or if I resize the screen. And another hook that I mentioned was the use callback, and that's the one that you can utilize when you have a callback function and that is being passed to some React components, and you want to only make sure that it only changes when the data that the callback uses changes. So that, for example, if somewhere deep down your component tree, you're using that callback and you sort of pass it down, then it's nice that you can rely on it not being changed so that the whole component tree doesn't re-render every time. And that's the callback called React use callback hook, sorry. And the rule is the same, you just pass some dependencies, which is actually the same in this case. And I could do the same for the next, but skip that. The next hook that is interesting is use effect. And that can be used for all sorts of things. But as the name changes, it's usually side effects. So anything imperative that the component needs to do sort of around itself. You can think things like changing the title of the window or changing the URL, for example, as we're going to do now, or possibly some other stuff that I will talk about later. But that's a different hook in regards to the return value. It doesn't have any return value, so you just call it React use effect, like this. And then the first argument is, as you can see, the effect callback. That's just a function. And inside the function here, we want to update the URL. So remember, as I was browsing around here, then the offset up there is changed. So we can use the window that was history that push state, and the state that we're pushing is it's a stupid API. It's just nothing. And then like the most important stuff in the beginning, and then the URL, right? So that's window that history that path location. Path name. Right, and then we're gonna have our query parm called offset, and that's gonna be equal to the offset. And now I can see we actually don't have offset available, but it's coming from the use pagination, right? So we can just pass it through because it was here. Cool. So let me make it bigger. Things are happening. and the way it is right now, it's all good, but the use effect will be run every time the function renders, right? So again, if we want to make it optimized, like imagining that the push state is some kind of a performance problem here, then we can add this array. If it's empty, then it will only run on the component mount, but it's not empty, right? So, I mean, shouldn't be empty because we depend on the offset. So now it's gonna run every time the offset changes. So basically when I move the buttons. And yeah, one more thing that we should probably add here is get the initial value so that when we refresh the page, the state from the URL is reflected. And I'll just take some code here. Yeah, it's basically that, right? So on the render, we take the query parameters from the URL, and we get them as this initial offset variable, and we can then pass it to the use pagination, right? Because that's where all the pagination stuff happens. And then we get the initial value here, and that's basically the one used here, right? Because that's the initial value of the offset. And if I did everything right, oh, why is it undefined here? I'm not gonna debug it now. Window location. Let's just take this. It might be that there was some kind of, oh. Yeah. Like this, and then probably, yeah. It should work, and hopefully when we refresh, yeah. So that works nicely. Again, this is run on every render, right? So basically when I move stuff around, it's reading the URL and extracting this initial offset every time, which is also not ideal. And the way you can go around it is extract this into a function and then not call it here. So get initial offset function. That's not a hook, it's just a function. And then return that. And the use state, so if we do this, right, then nothing really changed, right? We're still calling it on every render. But if we change this into a different use state, where instead of an initial value we provide a function, then that function will only be called on the first render. And that way we can make sure that if this computation of the initial parameter is for some reason expensive, or we don't want to do it every time, then that's like a nice escape hatch here. And I think we're gonna skip or I can just show you how you could do the keyboard navigation, where you use the left and right arrows to navigate. And if I find it here, yep. So that's the code that does it. Interesting part here is that it's a React use effect hook that essentially sets up a key down listener. But we have something here that we haven't had in our previous use of the use effect hook, which is the return value from the use effect hook. And that can be used to clean up. So because we don't really know how often and when, or we cannot guarantee that the hook is going to run, then like in this case, there would be a new event listener created for like every time I change the offset. And that's okay. It's not like a performance problem or anything. But if then I clicked it a lot, then I would have a lot of those listeners. So then a way around that is to return a cleanup function that will remove that event listener. So then we always have just one. And that's more or less it. I have one more thing which is pretty fun. For that we need to install this retoggle. It's a library from NPM. And what it gives you, so you can import an inspector, and you can import a use knob, something. Use range knob from retoggle. And then you take this inspector and you just render it. Typo. Yes. Yep. So now you can see that it rendered something here. It's just empty. It's like a drawer. But then we can fill this drawer using custom hooks provided by this retoggle. And for example, one nice thing would be to figure out what should be this ratio. Like it's just like I put in 0.7, but maybe there's like a ratio that will make the chart nicer. So instead of doing this, we can say that the ratio in percent, because we can actually only do int values here, it's gonna be this like return value from this use range knob, where we'll say like ratio, and then the initial value I think it's called is gonna be 70, and then min is like 5, and max is 100. It's percentage. And then our bar ratio is basically this divided by 100, right? So now what happens here is that we have a small knob here, and then we can try to test the width that fits in the graph. All right? And then if we're gonna go even more crazy, then we could put the same thing for the bar width, and then like initial value of what was it, 80, and then to like 300, I don't know, and then this should be bar width. Alright, so we have another one, so we can also adjust that, so we can play around and see, maybe like build a value that is really nice. And what's worth noting is that inside here, this use range knob, it keeps state, right? But I didn't have to do any kind of changes in the DOM. I didn't have to like change this component to a class component just because I want to do this. I just like take this from a library and use it, and it worked great. And that's more or less the demo. So we can go back to the presentation. Time? 5. All right. So as I mentioned, the hooks are experimental, but it was actually very hard to resist when I first saw them to not use them. So I did, and I used them, as I said, for around 2 months now on several projects. So I have some thoughts about how it went. So first of all, and I think you probably saw it, the API surface of React that I use on a daily basis actually went down, not up. And that's because if you think about the React component class, its API is actually pretty elaborate. It has like all sorts of this like should component mount and or like did component mount, I don't know. There's all of these things, and then you have to really think hard about where to put which part of the stateful logic that you have. And with this, like you only get the thing that you need and you use it and it works very nicely. So like all these, there have been some voices that, you know, React is like the surface of the API is growing and it starts to resemble Angular, but I think it's actually the opposite. And one thing I noticed is that hooks really feel native to in the world of React. And what I mean by that is that I think in the past we sort of lived with these like higher order components and render props, sort of just like closed one eye, just to get this great great declarative rendering. But now we don't have to close our eye because basically the hooks are very, very similar in how they work to components. I mean, on some level, right? Because like these built-in hooks, they are sort of like the like building components, right? That's what the framework gives you, and these custom hooks are a little bit like user-defined components in that you build your own stuff, and they compose in a similar way. So it really feels like this belongs in the world of React. Yes, hooks help making right decisions about local state or like where to put the state. And I think that's a little bit like out of laziness because in the past I would like just combine all my state either in Redux if it's like really big, right? But if it's just a small app, then I would create like this one huge class component and keep all the state in there, just because it was easier than to have like pure functional components that I could, for example, render easily in the storybook or something like that. But now with hooks, actually, because it's like so little effort to add that state, you actually think more about where the state belongs in the component tree, and you put it right there where it needs to be. And I think as I showed you with these toggles, because you now have much more, like it's much easier to add stateful logic, and then it opens to a lot of like playfulness with the code. Like you can really figure out different patterns of how to combine logic together and build these like stateful little machines that you can tweak. So I discovered that I did much more of that when hooks came to be. Another thing is that I haven't showed any of that, but you can use the use effect hook to fetch data, or like to interact with your API, and that's like completely fine. You can do it. There is some awkwardness to it. For example, the function inside the use effect, it cannot be an async function, and that's simply because you cannot return anything that is not a cleanup function from this effect hook. And of course, there's way around it. Like you can just like define your function somewhere else, and like your async function somewhere else, and then you call it. But it all like it's not there, and you don't really see many examples like out there of people doing that. And there is a good reason, and that's because there is a different API coming to React called Suspense. That's gonna deal exactly with that, like this data fetching logic. That's coming to React in a different way than hooks. So even though you can still do these things with the hooks, and you'll probably do it because like you got rid of your class components, right? So you have to put these things somewhere, unless you're using something like Redux, of course. But it is with that like asterisk that this is probably going to change soon, because there's a much more powerful and sort of suited for that exact purpose API coming. One thing that you stumble upon is that you will forget to add a dependency, like in this array at the end, and like that will cause a weird behavior in your app. That will take a while to debug, but I think in the end you sort of learn to remember about these things, and then it works fine. But I think that's sort of number one source of confusion and bugs is not keeping that array of dependencies up to date. And there is some kind of ESLint rule, I think, coming up where you sort of will be able to fix it. Just like save and get all the dependencies filled for you. So it should get easier. And one thing I learned, or like sort of learned to accept in the end, is that there is this hook that I haven't talked about at all, which is called use reducer, which comes in really handy when you start to have more state than just like a single variable, or more like when the state tree becomes bigger. And I actually like kept away from using it because I thought it's a little bit weird, this hook, but then I actually realized that the dependencies between these two is different than I thought. So I thought that the use reducer is like some kind of additional Redux-like thing that's using use state. But actually it's the other way around. Like use state is a dumbed down version of use reducer. So actually if you use the use reducer hook, you're like sort of closer to the implementation. And it makes you sort of understand the way it works better. So like in the end, when I had like more complex trees, then I started to use the reducer, the use reducer, and it worked quite nicely. Yes, and that's basically everything I had for today. My name is Maciej, and you can follow me on Twitter here. And I work at Maersk Digital, where we do some fun stuff, also with hooks, as you can see. And we are also hiring, and I have some stickers, so come talk to me. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Let's say you make that pagination navigation thing into a component, which also needs to use a state hook. When will you initialize it? Is there a good pattern for doing that up top of the app, or the first component that will use it, or?
So I think all the things you learned in the past in React still apply, right? I mean, for all intents and purposes, you can think of the component using hooks as a class component using state, for example, right? So it's sort of still like the topmost place you would use the state, right? That's the one where you probably need to localize it, right? Because there's no way of like passing state up. That's sort of not the way React works, right?
So if you had like a list where you do pagination on the top of the list and on the bottom of the list, it will actually be the pagination that will initiate the offset values instead of the list doing it.
Yeah.
For example.
Yeah, it would be like a top-level component, right? In some top meaning of the word top here, right? Yeah. Yes.
How do you use it with context? It seems like it would be a good candidate to combine with context somehow.
Yes, it's actually a very nice candidate to combine with context, and there is a hook for using context, which makes I've never used context in the past, like mostly because it was always like this feature that is sort of experimental. Then they made the nice context, right? But that was only for a while before hooks came in. So then I first used context in a bigger app using hooks, and it was so nice because the way you do it, maybe I can show here. If we know the reference, yes, there's the context. Yeah, so basically you like import the context from the place where it's defined, and of course somewhere on the like top level of your app you have your provider, but then you don't have to worry about the consumer stuff at all, right? So you only have the provider, and then you have this hook wherever you need your context. So you don't have to wrap the tree in the context that provider anymore. You just sort of get it the value right in line with your render function, right? That's a really nice feature of hooks, is that they flatten your files, they flatten your React. Everything is like on the same level without all these render props and sort of nesting, all of that. All right, seems we're done.
Another thing worth mentioning as well, I think, is like you can also return a component from a hook, and like one of the form libraries showcased also did that. Did you get to use that in any way, or?
Yeah, I think I did. I think like my implementation of this pagination was that these buttons were actually, it wasn't the props for buttons, it were the actual buttons that were returned, right? And then you just like stick them in your render tree wherever you needed them. So that's also a nice pattern for sure. Like one thing that is definitely a gotcha is that this ref here, like you could also define it inside the custom hook. But actually, it is sort of a, like, if you can talk about best practices already, but it is a best practice to define it like next to where it's used, because it is possible that then for some reason you will need a reference to the main again, right? And you cannot define two references. So that way, and you sort of don't know what happens with that reference inside the hook. So that's like one gotcha.